to MTG Mountain Talks series New to Standard. This video is part of the mini-series Breaking Down the Game, discussing the mechanics of the board and how cards are organized in the play space. Be sure to check out our other videos in this mini-series to get a well-rounded introduction to how to play.
Unlike typical board games, the MTG board is more of an imaginary space between you and your opponent. There isn't an actual board that you roll out, but there is structure to the way cards are placed on the board. In order to make sure that all players understand what cards are and aren't in play, there is a specific way to lay cards out on the play space. There are several key zones on the board. There are 3 zones controlled by each individual player: his or her own library, hand, and graveyard. Each of these is made up of cards from the player's starting deck. There are 4 other zones, all shared by each player: the battlefield, exile, the stack, and the command zone.
It is important to note that your opponent can control your cards and you can control theirs when spells allow for it. However, once that card is destroyed or removed from your opponent's control, it returns to your control or your graveyard. As an example, you can cast In Bolas's Clutches on a target permanent card on the battlefield that your opponent controls, and that card will be in your control. If your opponent can destroy your In Bolas's Clutches, though, they will get their card back.
Let's take a closer look at each zone, starting with the 3 zones controlled by individual players. The library consists of a single player's deck. These cards are in a single pile face down, usually near the upper right or left side of the half of the play space designated to the library's controller. Usually cards on the top of the library are unknown, and that a player does not know what card he or she will draw next. However, there are spells and magic that allow players to look at their own and even their opponent's top card or cards in the library.
The library should generally go untouched throughout the course of the game, except during that player's draw step, or unless spells instruct the library to be shuffled or reordered in any way. However, it is legal to touch your own library at any time, as long as you don't reveal or reorder any of the cards.
Keep in mind that you are only allowed to touch an opponent's deck immediately after he or she has shuffled at the start of the game and presented it to you, for you to cut or shuffle further. Or your opponent is instructed to shuffle his or her deck based on spells cast throughout the game. Touching another player's deck without game instructions to do so can result in an immediate loss.
The hand is a zone that consists of cards a player has drawn from his or her library or cards that have been returned to the hand from various other zones. The maximum hand size a player can keep at the end of his or her turn is 7, unless there are cards in play that specifically state otherwise. If exceptions do not apply, at the end of the turn, if there are more than 7 cards in a player's hand, he or she will have to discard cards from their hand into the graveyard until 7 cards remain in hand. There is generally no penalty for having 0 cards in hand, though.
Once you have become more experienced in Magic, keep in mind that if you have 2 or more cards in your hands, they should be in a constant state of motion with the flick, flick sound to intimidate your opponent and to annoy any viewers that may be watching live on video.
He does it all the time. The graveyard consists of cards that were once in a player's library and is a pile of cards face up, usually below the library on the board. Cards can enter the graveyard in many ways. Once you have cast an instant or sorcery spell and it resolves, it enters the graveyard unless there is a condition that requires it to be exiled or returned to your hand. Cards that have been discarded, either by having too many cards in hand at the end of the turn or from a spell that directs you to discard, are also placed into the graveyard.
When you cast a spell that is countered by an opponent's spell, like Negate, these cards do not resolve, meaning their effects do not apply to the game and they are placed in the graveyard. Some cards have effects that require you to sacrifice a card you control, such as Fling, which states that sacrificing a creature is part of its casting cost. Cards that have been sacrificed also go into your graveyard.
Note that token cards, when they are placed into the graveyard, are removed from the game. So you cannot get tokens back from the graveyard, but they do cause abilities of other cards on the battlefield, like Ashes of the Abhorrent, to trigger if a card has an ability triggered when creatures are killed or put into the graveyard. Also, any permanent spell that was previously residing on the board and has been destroyed enters its owner's graveyard.
Players can look at one another's graveyards at any time. This action is usually related to being able to cast cards out of graveyards, or even getting a better idea for what cards a player has cast. It is important to understand that in Standard, the order of cards in the graveyard is not necessarily important because there are currently no cards in the format that rely on graveyard order. However, in other formats, cards in graveyards cannot be rearranged, and this will apply to Standard if similar cards are added to the format. So keep an eye out for rule changes when new sets release.
If you are playing a 2-sided card that has been flipped to the backside, such as Search for Azcanta, it will enter the graveyard as the flipped face, Azcanta the Sunken Ruin. However, once it's in the graveyard, it returns to the front face. This is important because the front face, searched for Azcanta, is an enchantment, while the back side is a land. Cards like the third chapter of the Mending of Dominaria allow you to return lands from your graveyard. However, once Azcanta the Sunken Ruin resides in the graveyard, it reverts back to being an enchantment. It cannot be a valid target for Mending of Dominaria.
Now let's talk about the 4 zones shared between players. The battlefield is a zone where all permanent cards reside in the play space. A permanent is a spell that remains on the battlefield for a period of time, including artifacts, enchantments, creatures, lands, tokens, and planeswalkers. Instant and sorcery spells are not permanents as they are cast for an immediate effect and then are placed in the graveyard. There are 2 new rules for the battlefield setup required for tournament play.
First, lands must be closest to their controller. No other permanents can be placed in line or behind the lands. Also, creatures must be placed at the front of the battlefield on the half of the play space designated for their controller. Think about this as using them to defend your play space. Then, non-creature, non-land permanents, such as artifacts, enchantments, and planeswalkers, are usually placed between the creatures and the lands, or off to the side of the battlefield opposite of the library and the graveyard.
The stack is one of the hardest zones to understand for players new to Magic, and it doesn't have an actual physical location. Essentially, once you cast a spell, it goes on the stack before it resolves. The term resolves means that the effects of the instant or sorcery spell are allowed, or the permanent spell, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, or planeswalkers, enters the battlefield. It is important to note that lands are not cast, so land cards cannot be countered, and they do not enter the stack.
Once on the stack, your opponent gains priority, where he or she gets to cast an instant spell or a spell with flash in response to yours. The stack follows a simple rule. The first spell in is the last spell to resolve. So you and your opponent can duel it out, casting spells back and forth until either of you chooses not to cast another spell.
If multiple spells are cast and on the stack, the last spell resolves first, and all the other spells resolve in backwards order, with the first spell resolving last. The best way of thinking of it is to stack the cards / abilities on top of each other as they are cast, and then when no player has any more cards abilities, start taking the cards / abilities off of the top of the stack, using each one as you take it off the stack.
Let's look at an example. If I cast Pia Nalaar, my opponent can decide whether he or she is okay with that. In response, let's say my opponent uses Essence Scatter to counter my spell. Unless I have a counterspell of my own, like Negate, I cannot respond to Essence Scatter. Because Pia was cast first, she resolves last. The Essence Scatter will counter her. Notice that she has an ability that says when she enters the battlefield, I can create a Thopter token. But because she was countered on the stack, she never enters the battlefield and goes straight to my graveyard. Thus, I do not get a Thopter token.
To add a little bit more complexity to the mix, Dominaria introduced a mechanic that triggers abilities of cards that already exist on the battlefield by simply casting historic spells, which are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. So let's say I have Cabal Paladin already out of the battlefield. His ability states that when I cast a historic spell, a legendary artifact, or a saga spell, Cabal Paladin deals 2 damage to my opponent. Even though Pia Nalaar, a legendary creature, did not resolve, I did still cast her, so my opponent will take 2 damage to his or her life total.
The stack is a zone that will become more clear as you play more and see how cards interact.
The Exile Zone is a place where cards go when they are removed from the game. In Exile, cards are considered to be out of play. However, there are cards like Squee the Immortal that can be cast from Exile. Additionally, Exile is not necessarily a permanent place. If we look at the enchantment Ixalan's Binding, it states that the card it targets remains in exile as long as this copy of Ixalan Bindings remains on the battlefield. So if an opponent plays Ixalan Binding on one of your creatures, but then you use a spell like Naturalize to destroy that copy of Ixalan's Binding, your card will be removed from exile.
Note that just like when tokens are killed, they do not enter the graveyard, tokens that are exiled are removed from the game rather than being exiled, even though they are not technically dead. There are some cards, such as Bomat Courier, that require you to exile cards face down. In this case, you cannot look at those cards exiled with Bomat Courier until you use his ability to pay 1 red mana, sacrifice him, and discard your hand. If Bomat Courier is removed from the battlefield before you use his ability, those cards remain exiled face down and you cannot look at them for the duration of the game.
The final zone is the Command Zone, a holding place for cards that have an effect throughout the entire game. Cards in the Command Zone cannot be destroyed, exiled, removed from the game, or interacted with in any way. The command zone is a little less relevant in standard compared to other formats, as the only cards that reside in command zone are emblems. In the standard format, really only planeswalkers can produce emblems.
Let's look at Chandra Torch of Defiance as an example. Once Chandra's controller removes 7 loyalty counters from her, that player gets an emblem that states that whenever he or she casts a spell, the emblem deals 5 damage to target opponent. In the example with the Cabal Paladin, the player controlling Chandra's emblem doesn't even need the spell to resolve. He or she just needs to cast the spell to deal damage to the opponent. We'll highlight Chandra Torch of Defiance at the end of this lesson so that we can take a closer look at her and her impressive abilities. As we've seen, there are some particular mechanics of setting up and playing out the board. So let's watch a few turns in action, and the players will demonstrate the accepted board mechanics as they play. So the first thing we're going to do is roll to see who goes first. We're going to see who rolls highest. I rolled a 6. Jeff rolled a 7, so he gets to choose whether he wants to go first or draw first.
I'll go first.
Okay. After you're done shuffling, you present your deck to your opponent. They can then just simply cut the deck or actually shuffle it for some time. Okay, then you set your library up. It doesn't really matter where you put it, whether it's the left or the right. I like to do it on my left, but most people like to do it on their right hand side. So there's no super particular order to do it, as long as it's clearly out of the way of the battlefield, which is the middle space. Then you get to draw 7 cards and look at your hand to decide whether or not you want to keep those cards. The player who's going first gets to choose whether or not they're going to keep their hand or mulligan down to 6 cards first.
I'll keep.
And I will keep mine as well, so then the first player gets to go first. Okay, he placed a plane and pass his turn. I'm going to draw. So at the beginning, there's not a whole lot of untap upkeep. You just go straight to your draw. I'm going to play a forest, so lands go closest to the player. Then I'm going to tap that forest to cast a Llanowar Elf, and then I'm going to pass my turn.
Pass.
Okay. So then the first thing I'm going to do is untap. Then if there's any upkeep triggers, we would do that, but there's not very much going on the deck or on the table yet. Then I'm going to go ahead and draw. I am going to play Memorial to Unity, which is a land that comes in the battlefield tapped. And then I'm going to tap a forest to play Ovaya, who is also a creature. So notice I've kind of got my lands closest to me and then my creatures up at the top half of my battlefield to protect my play space. And then I will enter combat for 1 with my Llanowar Elf. And then you can use a life counter such as a d20 die to keep track of your life, and then I pass turn.
Pass.
Okay, untap, so everything untaps unless it says it does not untap. Then I'm going to go ahead and draw a card. I will place another forest. And then I'm going to pay 2 mana to play Heart of Kiran. Now, my opponent, Jeff, is playing a control deck, so he has spells in his deck to potentially counter my spell like a negate. So I usually look to him to say, does it resolve? And he,
sure.
And since it resolves, it actually goes out onto the battlefield. And then I can enter combat with my 2 creatures, Llanowar Elves and Ovaya, for 2 total damage.
17.
And then pass turn.
Pass.
Okay. Untap, draw. Okay, I don't have a land that I can play this turn, but my Llanowar Elf can produce mana, so I'll go ahead and tap my Llanowar Elf and 3 lands to play Walking Ballista with 2 counters.
Disallow, and I have to take a damage.
Okay, so since Jeff played a disallow that requires 2 blue, one of his lands can only produce blue mana if he takes a life. And now, because Ballista was not allowed to resolve into the battlefield, he actually, from the stack, as I'm waiting for Jeff to play disallow, is going to go into the graveyard. He does not enter the battlefield. So that was basically just a quick tutorial of how to set up your board. Remember, your lands go closest to you. I do have other cards in my deck. Let me find something really quickly. A Mox Amber, which produces mana. Typically that's going to go in between or closer to your land so that you know that produces mana. Planeswalkers, such as Teferi, like he has in his deck, would also kind of go in the middle, but your creatures need to be at the front so that your opponent knows what you can potentially attack them with, and your lands always go closest to you so that you know what you can cast.
For this lesson's card spotlight, we will have Chandra, Torch of Defiance, a planeswalker from the Kaladesh set that takes 2 mana of any color and 2 red mana to cast. For most of these episodes moving forward, we will focus on cards from sets that will not be rotating out in the fall of 2018. But Chandra, Torch of Defiance, is such an insane card that she is worth highlighting. In Magic, Planewalkers enter the battlefield with a set of loyalty counters, which is essentially their life total. They usually have several abilities to either add or remove loyalty counters. However, usually only one ability can be activated per turn, and only when you could cast a sorcery spell, which is during your first and second main phases.
Chandra, Torch of Defiance enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters, and you can activate her abilities as soon as she enters the battlefield. She actually has 2 ways to add loyalty counters to her, indicated by the +1 symbols. You can add 1 loyalty counter to add 2 red mana to your mana pool, or add 1 counter to exile the top card of your library. Then you can either cast that card or leave it in exile to allow Chandra to do 2 damage to your opponent. Of course, there are advantages to either of these. If you really need the 2 red mana to cast another spell, or maybe use Pia Nalaar's ability to pump up one of your artifact creatures, you can add a loyalty counter to Chandra for mana.
It is important to note that if you use the ability for mana, you don't have to use the mana at all if you just want to add a counter to Chandra. This will increase her toughness. But you must use that mana before moving into combat or the end phases of your turn, as mana pools deplete at the end of each phase. Generally, you will use her ability to exile the top card if you have mana to potentially cast whatever card is revealed, or if you really need to deal 2 damage to your opponent. The real benefits of this ability is that you get to see and potentially cast an additional card during your turn. But remember that if the revealed card is a land, you must exile it, because land can't be cast. There are also 2 ways to remove loyalty counters from Chandra. Her first option is to remove 3 counters to deal 4 damage to a target creature. So with this ability, she is essentially a removal spell to get rid of a creature your opponent controls. As we discussed earlier in the lesson, her second ability requires you to remove 7 loyalty counters from Chandra to get her emblem, which states that whenever you cast a spell, the emblem deals 5 damage to a target opponent.
This is so powerful because even if you have done no damage to your opponent at this point in the game, once you cast 4 spells, you can bring your opponent's life total down 20 points. From my experience, as soon as Chandra reaches 7, the following turn her controller removes 7 counters, which destroys her, but oh well, because in just a few spells, they win the game.
Plus, you have to admit that her fiery good looks make her quite attractive, and if you're playing a red deck, just make room for a couple copies of her. You know, twins.
Remember that as a Planeswalker, Chandra, Torch of Defiance can be attacked by your opponent's creatures. So if you really want to get her to an ultimate reward of spending 7 loyalty counters and killing your opponent in just a few spells, you really want to make sure that you can remove their creatures or block for her with your creatures. Because once she has 0 loyalty counters, she dies.
Well, that's all for this video, and we hope to see you in our Facebook community, MTG Mountain Talk, New to Standard, with the group URL of MTG New to Standard, and you can get the full URL in the description below. This is a new community, so please feel free to invite your friends to join in the fun. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up. If you think it sucks, give us a thumbs down.
Hopefully you don't think it sucks, but this is our first video together, so. To get quick access to new videos, subscribe to our channel. We hope to be posting several new videos in the New to Standard series each month to help you on your journey to becoming an MTG Master. You can also get sneak peeks and refer back to all of our training material even before the videos are finalized and published, including scripts and images at our blog, mtgnewtostandard.com.
I wanna be the slip, word upon your lip, rather that you rip, break me down and build me up, whatever it takes, 'cause I love the adrenaline in my veins, I do whatever it takes.
Battlefield with a set number of loyalty counters, which is essentially their life total. They usually have several abilities to either add or remove loyalty counters. However, usually only one ability can be activated per turn, and only when you could cast a sorcery spell, which is during your first and second main phases.
What are you doing up here?
Hey buddy.
You gotta join the video. So this is Sunny. He's gonna join us for the rest of the video. Or add one loyalty counter to exile the top card of your library. Then you can either cast that card or leave it in exile to allow Chandra to do till
damage. Till.
However, once it's in the graveyard, it returns to the front face. This is important because of something.
The front face.
I lost the line.